They didn't just take my money, my home, or my future, they took my voice, my choices, and my sense of safety, and told me it was for my own good. But the day I finally took something back, I didn't scream or beg, because what I reclaimed changed them in ways they never expected. My name is Juliet, and the first time I realized my parents had been deciding my life without me was the afternoon my bank card declined at the grocery store, and my mother said calmly, like it was nothing, that she and my father had handled my finances for my own good. I stood there holding a receipt I could not pay for, and when I asked, "What do you mean?" she replied, "We made some decisions." And I felt something cold settle in my chest. My father walked in and said, "This is for your protection," and I asked from what, but neither of them answered. They talked over me, around me, about me, using words like responsibility and stability, while I sat there realizing my opinions were not part of the conversation. When I said, "I didn't agree to this," my mother sighed and said, "You didn't need to," as if my consent was optional. That night I asked for access to my accounts, and my father said, "We'll discuss it later," which I had learned meant never. I remembered signing papers years earlier, trusting them when they said, "This is temporary," and realizing temporary had turned permanent without my knowledge. When I questioned it, my mother said, "You're too emotional right now," and my father added, "We know better," like love came with authority. I asked, "What if I want something different?" And my father replied, "You don't understand how the world works." And my voice went quiet. I noticed how often decisions were made in rooms I wasn't invited into, and how afterward they were presented to me as facts. Legal folders appeared on the table one morning, and when I asked what they were, my mother said, "Just paperwork," and slid them away. I called Maya and said, "Something is wrong." And she answered, "You sound scared," and I finally admitted I am. She asked, "Why do they control everything?" And I said, "They say it's love." Even though the word felt thin. At dinner my father said, "We're only trying to help." And I replied, "Then why don't you ask me?" And he changed the subject. Every question I asked became evidence that I was ungrateful, unstable, or confused, and I started doubting myself. When I cried, my mother said, "You're overreacting." And when I went quiet, she said, "See, you understand." I didn't understand, but I was learning how to survive without making them uncomfortable. I asked my father, "Is any of this actually mine?" And he answered, "One day," which felt like a threat. That was when it hit me that my name was never on the decision, only the explanation. I wasn't losing things by accident, I was being managed. The love they described felt conditional, measured, and heavy, and I realized it came with rules I never agreed to. When I said, "This doesn't feel safe," my mother replied, "You're confusing safety with freedom." And my father nodded. I went to my room and stared at the door, realizing it had always locked from the outside. Maya texted, "You're allowed to want more," and I cried quietly because no one at home had ever said that. I thought about every time they said, "Trust us," and how trust had slowly replaced choice. That night I understood something terrifying, that everything taken from me was done carefully, legally, and on purpose. They didn't steal. They decided. They didn't ask. They assumed. And the worst part was realizing they truly believed they were right. I lay awake listening to my parents talk softly in the kitchen, planning my future like I was not in it. That was the moment my fear turned into clarity. I wasn't confused, I was controlled. And for the first time, I knew this was not love. It was preparation. They were preparing me to accept less without resistance. I whispered my own name out loud, like a reminder, and promised myself I would not disappear, even if I didn't know how yet. That understanding didn't free me, but it changed me, and change had finally begun. I didn't confront them again that night, because survival required patience. But I stopped apologizing in my head for wanting control over my own life. For the first time, I understood that love without choice was not love at all. It was a contract I never signed, and I was already planning how to break it, quietly, carefully, without asking permission from anyone ever again. I stared at the ceiling and let that truth settle into my bones without fear. For the first time ever. Alone, they didn't raise their voices when they explained it to me, which somehow made it worse. because calm sounded like certainty and certainty made doubt feel like my fault. My father said, "You're lucky to have parents who care this much," and I asked, "Why does caring feel like losing myself?" My mother replied, "Because you're confusing independence with risk," and I said, "Why don't I get to decide that?" She sighed and answered, "You're not ready," like readiness was something they controlled. When my phone buzzed with another bank notification I couldn't access, I asked, "Can I at least see my balance?" And my father said, "That would only stress you." I said, "Not knowing already does," and he replied, "Trust us," which felt like a command. At dinner my mother said, "You've been distant," and I answered, "I don't know where I'm allowed to stand anymore." She reached across the table and said, "We're protecting you." And I pulled my hand back because protection shouldn't feel like a cage. I remembered being 10 years old and hearing my father say, "Juliet doesn't need to worry about money," while signing something in another room. I remembered being 16 and asking, "Can I open my own account?" and hearing my mother say, "Why rush adulthood?" Those memories lined up too neatly now. When I cried in my room, my mother knocked and said, "Please don't be dramatic," and my tears dried out of embarrassment. My father said, "Strong women don't fall apart," and I wondered why strength always meant silence. I asked him, "What happens if I say no?" and he replied, "Then you'll regret it," without raising his voice. That scared me more than yelling ever could. Maya called and said, "They're crossing lines," and I whispered, "They say it's love," and she answered, "Love doesn't erase choice." I tried explaining to my parents and said, "I feel trapped," and my mother replied, "That's because freedom overwhelms you." I said, "You don't know that," and she answered, "We know you." Every conversation ended the same way, with my questions turned into proof that I couldn't handle responsibility. When I pushed harder, my father said, "This attitude is why we had to step in," and I felt myself shrinking. I noticed doors closing more often, decisions finalized before I spoke, and plans made without my presence. My parents called it guidance, but it felt like erasure. One night my mother said, "We've sacrificed so much for you," and I replied, "So why does it feel like I owe you my life?" She looked hurt and said, "You're being unfair," and I wondered when fairness became rebellion. I sat on my bed holding my phone, staring at locked apps and unreadable statements, feeling small and powerless. Maya texted, "You're allowed to leave," and I replied, "I don't know how," and she said, "You'll learn." I realized how often my parents spoke for me, decided for me, and corrected me, all while saying my name gently. They never said they were taking things away. They said they were holding them for me. That difference mattered to them, but not to me. I tried once more and said, "I need space," and my father replied, "Space is dangerous," and my mother nodded. I laughed then, a short broken sound, and said, "So is this," and they looked confused. They asked, "Why are you acting like this?" And I answered, "Because I'm disappearing." My mother said, "You're still here," and I whispered, "Not really." That night I collapsed on the floor of my room and said out loud, "I can't do this anymore." Maya stayed on the phone while I cried, and I admitted, "If I stay, I will lose myself completely." She said, "Then staying is not love," and hearing that made my chest ache. I lay there realizing something devastating, that obedience was the price of comfort, and freedom was treated like a flaw. They called control love, but love should not require surrender. As I wiped my face, I understood the truth I had been avoiding. Staying meant vanishing. And vanishing was no longer an option. I didn't announce my decision, because every important change in my life had always happened quietly, without permission or witnesses. Maya said, "You don't have to confront them yet," and I replied, "I'm not confronting, I'm learning." She nodded and said, "That's different," and I felt steadier hearing it. I started by asking small questions, not to my parents, but to documents, records, and timelines that had never lied to me. When I found a folder I didn't recognize, I asked my mother, "What is this?" and she answered, "Something you don't need to worry about." That was when I worried the most. I called Daniel and said, "I think something is wrong." And he replied, "Tell me what you see, not what you feel." I showed him papers I barely understood, and he said they went further than guidance, and my hands started shaking. I asked, "Is this legal?" and he paused before saying, "It's complicated but not invisible." That sentence changed everything. Maya sat beside me while I reread every page, every signature, every decision made without my voice. I whispered, "They did this on purpose," and she said, "Yes," without softening it for the first time. I didn't rush to defend them. I asked Daniel, "What do I do?" And he said, "You take back what's yours carefully." I felt guilt rise and said, "They're my parents," and he replied, "That doesn't erase your rights." That word, rights, felt unfamiliar but powerful. I didn't sleep much that night, not from fear, but from clarity that refused to let me look away. The next morning I told my parents, "I need to talk," and my voice didn't shake. My father said, "This isn't a good time," and I answered, "It is for me." I placed the documents on the table and said, "Explain these." My mother stared at them and said, "You went behind our backs," and I replied, "You went behind my life." My father said, "We did what we had to," and I asked, "Who decided that?" He said, "We did," and I finally said, "That's the problem." My mother reached for my hand and said, "You don't understand how dangerous the world is." And I pulled away. I said, "I understand now how dangerous control can be." My father raised his voice and said, "You're being manipulated." And I answered, "I'm being informed." They looked at each other, and I saw something I hadn't seen before. Fear. My mother said, "You're overreacting," and I replied, "I'm responding." My father said, "If you do this, things will change," and I answered, "They already have." I didn't apologize. I didn't soften my words. I didn't ask them to understand. I said, "I'm reclaiming my accounts, my decisions, and my name," and the room went quiet. My mother whispered, "You're breaking this family," and I said, "You broke me first." That was the moment everything shifted. I stood up, not shaking, not crying, just finished. My father said, "Where are you going?" And I replied, "Somewhere I can breathe." I packed one bag and left the house without slamming a door. Outside, Maya waited and said, "You did it," and I answered, "I started." Daniel called later and said, "The paperwork is moving," and I said, "Thank you," without guilt. I checked my account myself for the first time and whispered, "This is real, not the money. The control. The choice." That night I said my name out loud again, slowly, like it belonged to me. I didn't feel powerful. I felt present. I understood something then that no one had ever taught me. Power doesn't arrive with permission. It arrives when you stop asking for it. I slept deeply for the first time in years. When I woke up, nothing was fixed yet, but it was mine to fix. The consequences did not explode. They unfolded slowly, the way truth always does when it no longer needs my silence to survive. My father called first and said, "We need to talk," and I replied, "About what?" Even though I already knew. He said, "Things are getting complicated," and I answered, "They were complicated when I wasn't allowed to know." My mother emailed and wrote, "We never meant to hurt you," and I stared at the sentence until it lost meaning. Maya asked, "Do you want me to read it?" And I said, "No, I want to feel nothing." Daniel called and said, "The authority they had is gone," and I asked, "Completely?" and he said, "Legally and practically." I didn't smile. I sat quietly and said, "Good," because calm felt earned. My parents faced questions they could not answer with tone or history. They could not explain love as control anymore. They could not say protection when documents said otherwise. My father said later, "People are misunderstanding us," and I replied, "People are finally understanding me." My mother said, "We did our best," and I answered, "Your best still hurt me." They asked to meet, and I agreed, not because I owed them closure, but because I trusted myself now. At the table my father said, "We lost trust," and I replied, "You spent mine first." My mother whispered, "Can we fix this?" and I said, "Only with honesty." She asked, "What does that mean?" and I replied, "No control, no guilt, no rewriting." My father said, "We were scared," and I answered, "So was I alone." They asked what I wanted, and for the first time, the question did not scare me. I said, "Space and respect." And the room went quiet. My mother cried and said, "You've changed." And I replied, "I stopped disappearing." After that, I built my days carefully, choosing quiet mornings and steady work. I paid my own bills and made my own decisions without checking for permission. Maya said, "You look lighter," and I answered, "I stopped carrying their fear." My parents called less often, and when they did, their voices were unsure. They were learning what it meant to speak without authority. My father said once, "We don't know how to help now," and I replied, "That's not your job anymore." He didn't argue. That silence told me everything. I moved into a place that felt like mine and locked the door from the inside. I slept without listening for footsteps or voices. I worked without explaining myself. When my mother asked, "Are you happy?" I said, "I'm peaceful." She paused and said, "I don't think we understood you." And I answered, "You didn't have to." Daniel checked in and said, "You handled this with restraint." And I replied, "I handled it with truth." Maya hugged me and said, "You survived," and I said, "I lived." My parents tried again weeks later and said, "We want to rebuild," and I answered, "Then respect the distance." My father asked, "Will you ever forgive us?" And I replied, "Forgiveness isn't permission." That was the moment I saw it change them. They stopped asking for access. They stopped correcting my tone. They stopped speaking over me. They listened, awkwardly, imperfectly. But they listened. I didn't celebrate their discomfort. I let it teach them. I learned that reclaiming my life didn't require revenge or punishment. It required consistency. Boundaries. Silence when necessary. My parents lost control. And in losing it, they learned something they never expected. I was not theirs to manage. I was mine to protect. One evening Maya asked, "Do you feel free?" And I said, "I feel whole." I stopped explaining my choices to people who never protected them. I stopped apologizing for peace. I stopped shrinking. I didn't destroy my family. I stopped sacrificing myself to keep it together. That distinction mattered. As I closed my door that night, I said my name quietly and smiled. Nothing was taken from me anymore. Everything I kept was by choice.